Hi, my name is Jeff White. I am going to be talking today about the 1960s. The person that I interviewed was a female who grew up in South Dakota. She was born in 1952. She's Caucasian. Grew up in a rural community in South Dakota that didn't have a whole lot of pulp culture mediums, with the exception of perhaps maybe if a person next door had a television or also records. One of the first things that I had asked her, just because me thinking of the 60s, was basically how big of a deal were the Beatles, and she immediately spoke up and said they were tremendous. She had discussed basically along the lines of how she was in grade school, and even though she was in grade school, the older kids were in the room next to her and they were always talking about the Beatles, and they wanted to be like the Beatles and scream when the Beatles came on the radio. And it left such a mark on her that she still remembers the time that she saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show when they first came to the United States. She basically said that kids went wild for the Beatles. We went on to discuss basically how the late 1960s, how she remembers pulp culture. First I had to kind of explain the definition of pop culture, because even me now, I really didn't fully understand it until taking this class. We also discussed some of the trends, bell bottoms, some of the stereotypical things you think of in the 60s, as well as how things are different. And she transitioned to basically how they're similar to today as well. One of the first things I did was I related to her by discussing the first time that I had listened to the Beatles, which was on a trip to Montana. It was a double disc on CD of a compilation of a lot of their music, and I listened to it the whole entire way up to Montana. I also kind of discussed, because my own stereotypical thoughts of the 1960s are, typically hippies and pot smokers, so on and so forth, and that kind of got us talking and kind of opened up the conversation a little bit. The biggest thing that I got from this was that the Beatles changed the whole entire generation, but not just the Beatles, but in preparing to go to war as a nation in Vietnam, the Beatles more or less provided a little bit of an outlet for teenagers and children within pulp culture. So I started to ask her, what were some of the trends that she remembered, and she immediately remembered stereotypical things such as bell bottoms, and she still remembers how horrible looking they were, even though she used to wear them. She's talked about wearing pastel shirts, turtlenecks, all of those things. When she looks at pictures of herself now, she's just completely embarrassed that she even dressed that way, and I think it's pretty funny. I always think of like Dazed and Confused, how they're trying to put those tight pants on, and then they get the huge bottoms on them, and it's just pretty funny to me, to be honest with you. She'd also discussed some of the trends were to cruise Main Street all night long. You would only basically stop to fill up the cars, get beer, go up to get some ice cream. You try to pack as many people as you could in the car as possible and just cruise up and down Main Street all night long. It reminded me a lot of the movie American Graffiti, even though that was actually took place in the 50s. It was still taking place all the way through the 60s, and to be honest, it's even kind of similar now, because I remember when I was a teenager, we used to do kind of the same thing, but it wasn't necessarily Main Street. I did started to ask her kind of what some of the differences are between pop culture now and pop culture back in the 1960s. And one of the biggest things was that she discussed was for people now, there's so many different mediums for them to get information or to see their favorite pop star or their favorite music or whatever it might be, because we have Facebook. And she had mentioned how you could basically be looking to see what your favorite TV star or pop star is doing on your phone while you're watching your favorite music video on the TV. So because of all those mediums, people are so incredibly well informed now. She had discussed that basically, like say with the Beatles, how when the Beatles first came around, they had to buy their record or else watch them on the Ed Sullivan Show. She wasn't really able to listen to them on the radio that much, because where she was at, the radio focused on the pig and cattle market. So they would buy that record and they would just listen to it for a whole entire year. And she had mentioned how it wasn't like now, where you would get a new song every single week or every 2 weeks. You had your music for about the year, and that's pretty much what it was. The discussion also changed a little bit to what some of the similarities are, and she had started to mention that there was a big fundamentalist movement back then, religious fundamentalist movements, as well as she kind of cringed a little bit and said we still started stupid wars, and she had discussed Vietnam War, and then kind of compared that to Iraq and Afghanistan. She said obviously for pop culture and for younger people, one of the biggest similarities in general was the use of alcohol and drugs. And it kind of surprised me that in such a rural community back then that she said it was that rampant. And she said basically, everybody would drink and drive. Pot was a big deal where she was at, not necessarily hard drugs like it would be now with meth, but alcohol and drugs really were a pretty big deal out in that rural community, just like they would have been in any city and they are today. That pretty much brought me to the end of my interview. So basically, we talked about what it was like to live in South Dakota in a rural environment during the 1960s, how the Beatles pretty much kind of changed the world and prepared the nation as they were gearing up for war in Vietnam. Some of the trends, the bell bottoms that she still cringes about, even thinking that she was wearing them. And we discussed some of the differences as well as similarities. But besides some of the tacky clothing and the invention of the internet, the times between then and now, they're really not that much different.